everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often, those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show, or it's a Rejoinder episode. This is a Rejoinder episode. Robert Kloss is back. He's talking about his new book, The Genocide House. He's also the author of A Light No More and The Woman Who Lived Amongst the Cannibals, both from inside the castle, as well as The Alligators of Abraham, The Desert Places, and The Revelator. He currently resides in Chicago. Before we get into our conversation with Robert, let's remind you how you can support the show. Patreon.com/noisemakerjoe is a good way to do it in a recurring sort of way. For $2 a month, you get these episodes a little bit earlier than everybody else. You can also throw a one-time donation my way, paypal.me/noisemakerjoe. You can buy my book. It's called Tired. It's pretty darn good. Or for free, you can do the things like signal boosting. You know, signal boosting. All right. Now, without any further ado, let's get into my conversation with Robert. I want to start in, I guess, an odd place, maybe. I want to start with the interludes. Because... Okay. Because I live in Grand Rapids, Roger B. Chaffee was one of the astronauts who died in that fire, in that accident during that training exercise. And so, like, I walk past his statue all the time. And, like, I've seen shows in the Roger B. Chaffee Planetarium at the museum, which is right close to my work. So it's like, we're very proud of our boy. And and so, like, that's that. And so the sort of engine failure thing, also in that Jake Gyllenhaal movie about him building the rockets, there's like a brief like scene about that engine failure that was really affecting to me as a kid. So because of that event itself is very much kind of easy for me to bring up, and the way that you kind of interpolated that with the moon landing, and in the first interlude, and then in the second interlude, smooshing together Richard Nixon resigning and Bud Dwyer killing himself in front of all those reporters. And I had only just realized or learned about that too. So, like, it was very much right time, right place for those. And that's those things, the way that you smushed those two events together within the interludes, kind of colored my perception of the book. And so I want to start with kind of talking about why you did that for the interludes.
That's a that's a good question. The decision to have the interludes kind of came late in the writing process, and going back, I think part of it was, I can't remember which of them it was, but if I remember correctly, one of those interludes was going to be another section. And I ended up realizing that I wanted to have these smaller snippets of, I always thought I like the smooshing aspect, that phrase smooshing. I always thought of it as kind of like the light bending when it hits the glass, like the history kind of seen askew, and things kind of the reception is kind of blurry, and things kind of ended up layering each other in a way. Is kind of how I always thought of it, which is kind of how I think of the book itself. So in a way, in my mind, it was the interludes as a device was kind of a way to work as a mortar for the larger sections, to bounce ahead in time without getting like really bogged down in writing something that wasn't like I didn't think the book could sustain itself over a certain amount of time, but I wanted, that kind of compressed style. I thought people, there's only so many pages you can have a style like that and still have people read it. So I wanted a certain arc. I wanted a certain trajectory. I wanted to cover this ground. And so the interludes I thought worked as like little snapshots of these moments. And those two moments in particular, the Dwyer and then the NASA, the Apollo tragedy. I also wanted the Challenger in there at some point. Those were kind of all in the running, partly because these are all things that are kind of tragedies that are captured in our kind of public consciousness because they were filmed and because they were transmitted in the news media and all of these things. So I find them particularly haunting because of that. And I've watched the YouTube videos of them many times because I find them so disturbing. And I remember watching The Challenger, or I have a vague memory of The Challenger, and that didn't make the book. I guess it'll pop in somewhere, but I just So just kind of the Nixon disgrace, leaving in disgrace, but also the Apollo, that kind of triumph being kind of layered with the tragedy. There's just something about it that I found disturbing, but also kind of illuminating in a way. So some of it was instinct and some of it was kind of, I felt like emblematic of the rest of the book and kind of the larger goal that I had for putting the book together.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question very well, but
I think so. I feel your answer makes me feel like I was on the right track, which is always good with books I read for this show. I sometimes feel like
I like that smooshing though.
Yeah. I also read Olivia Cronk's blurb where she mentioned Orlando, which I haven't read, but a booktuber my wife and I watch has recently read it, so I'm like familiar with what that story is. And the sort of like I thought a lot about A Light No More while I was reading this. How it was kind of ghostly. But I also remembered scrolling through the PDF you sent me and being like, "Oh, this is much more like novel shaped than the other books of yours I've read." And it's still distinctly a Robert Kloss book. It has your very unique style, which we talked about a lot in the last episode. But yeah, I like the sort of like reckoning with America sort of thing. I liked how I think it was the 1918 to 1921 section particularly like felt kind of like I want to say like standard transgressive fiction, but I feel like that's going to make people mad. But I don't know, like it felt, all the terrible things happening to young boys just felt very Cooper Bright, sort of like what I've come to expect from digging into the sort of classics of transgression. And so the book is kind of powerful for me in this way, because it so heavily contrasts another writer who I really enjoy, the video essayist, video game critic, and travelogue writer Noah Gervais, who makes expansive YouTube videos. And his travel logs particularly, especially as they kind of progress through time, like, because he's a guy who lives in the West and is very into cowboy stories and is very into travel writing and is very into like the national parks, kind of has this deep love for America that I like always tried really hard to figure out how he squares it. And the Genocide House kind of like hammers away any sort of understanding that I start to grab from those Noah essays, where it's like, yeah, like there is something to be said about like progress and like, you know, like for better or worse, like the national infrastructure projects of the highways, like, you know, zoomed out from a global like bird's eye view is like really impressive as a feat of engineering and logistics. And then it's always as you zoom back in, like the Genocide House is this sort of like supernatural, like, no, there's just weirdo rich people in houses somewhere doing gross stuff.
Yeah. I think the reason why I always kind of come back to the American, you know, it's not necessarily that I have a complicated relationship with American history, because I can get teary-eyed reading about John Adams and the founding fathers, like these kinds of things, or Abraham Lincoln. The Americana, I find it fascinating. Everything about it, I find it very fascinating. But I also, the darker aspects of it, I think, are always there. Like anything you talk about that we celebrate, there's always that underbelly of it. And I find that fascinating as well, that you can't get around. I was just thinking about how, when you have a country of the size that we've become and the power that we are, politicians don't even probably necessarily realize always the enormity of their gestures around the world, right? The kind of the vast evil that even like the slightest blink can create. And I guess that's one of the things I find really interesting about this country is on a macro level and on a micro level, you have these relationships between these incredibly powerful and unprecedented and marvelous triumphs that are also like deeply embedded in gestures of violence and evil, which to me kind of forces me to ask difficult questions of how I feel about these things. And, in the end, I don't really have an answer. Like I have to kind of accept that that's the way that things are in a sense, which I don't know how I feel about that either. But I've been the book that I'm writing now. I've been looking at a lot of these kinds of things as well, but asking myself like questions that I was just starting to, or confronting things that I was just starting to kind of nibble at with the Genocide House, I guess. But I think at the Genocide House, my favorite section maybe is not my favorite section, but the second section, the section that takes place inside the rich person's house. It was originally going to be the the Gilles de Rais section, and then it became the H. Holmes section, and then it became I was fascinated by the Chicago history and the slaughterhouses and all of the meat packing industry. And I thought a lot about, and I didn't live in Chicago at the time. I'd been to Chicago for like a couple days once. And now that once I moved here and I finished writing the book here, I really became fascinated with the idea of this history being born out of the town was really raised up out of this mechanized, industrialized slaughter. It's fascinating, and a lot of good came from the horrible progress that was made in that industry in this city. So I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that.
Yeah, it's so weird because I don't know, reading about history of any other country, I can kind of like look at it more objectively, I guess. And then I start learning about American history, and even like, especially like the Revolutionary Civil War era, like there is such an innate urge for me to cheer for something when I'm learning the history. And then I'm like, wait a minute. No. These people were terrible in the same way that like the Vikings were terrible, right? Like, like it's pretty, like it's not, once you hear someone be like, oh yeah, the Vikings were basically religious extremists, you're like, oh, you know what? Yeah. Still fun to read about though. Still fine to read about. Like, that's fun.
Religious extremists are fun to read about.
That's true.
Or they can be. It's true. And I think part of it is when we, or at least when I engage with media around American history, it's often in the form of a Ken Burns documentary, right? And Ken Burns has this really Megan and I just recently rewatched the Civil War, 22-hour long epic poem. And you just have like the swelling of emotion constantly. It's just the tone of it, the music, the voiceover, everything is in kind of like these heroic terms, this great struggle. And you feel like, even if like I'm an atheist, I don't believe in like the city on the hill and like all of this kind of stuff. But you watch those documentaries and you feel like you're part of like some kind of greater struggle. So that might be it as well. That, we're just kind of, in our history classes when we're little kids, I think that kind of Ken Burns tone is layered into us. I remember when I was in grad school and I first got into the Revolutionary War, and I was reading David McCullough's John Adams in 1776. That they had just come out. It's like, this is amazing. I was really moved by these books and, fascinated by his take. And then I read some other books about Adams, and he was just like cranky old bastard, according to those writers. And the more I read, the more I realized like the thing that I liked about these figures is, um, number one, the fallibility of them, I guess, like the humanness, um, the like we the Revolutionary War heroes were very much like real people that we've enlarged over time, which I think it makes it more relatable to understand. These were just like human beings that were found themselves in these incredible situations, and they had to take these leaps. And how does a regular person find themselves in a position where they can make these kinds of gestures? Abraham Lincoln was, by all accounts, a very good guy. Presided over a war where people butchered each other for 4 years, and he was willing to kill many more if he had to, for kind of like an abstraction, which is an incredible thing. He was willing to let slavery continue for this abstraction. He was willing to. So it was really thinking about how a human being can be capable of holding all of that together to be a good person, a decent person, and yet capable of like really monstrous things, I think is one of the things that more than when I read European history and I read about people like that, I don't necessarily think of it in that way. And I don't know if it's just because our heroes in American history are like always like rags to riches, kind of like self-taught log cabin types who grew up to be presidents, or if it's just because these are lessons that are kind of pounded into us when we're young kids or whatever. But
yeah,
I think that's what I find interesting about them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, Neil Armstrong was just a guy from Ohio, and like was the first human to walk on a celestial body. Just some guy from Ohio, right? Going back to Noah Gervais in his video on the Lincoln Highway, he, while in Ohio, talked a lot about Neil Armstrong and this idea that like he's just kind of like this jock pilot, and some NASA scientists hand him or show him this little pod that he has to sit in for however long, and he's just like, well, those boys really know what they're doing. And yeah, and I also feel like as Americans, we're like, because the country is so young, we're in the midst of the myth making, right? And yeah, because we don't have kings, right? Everybody's just like some dude from some backwater. And we're really starting to get away from that. The country is starting to become old enough that we have family dynasties. And they're so very boring. But I like how the Genocide House is kind of part of the American myth making, in that like smushing together. And the longer sections too, right? Like it kind of feels like we're painting a particular picture of Ohio. I really liked how in that second section it brought up the racism against Poles and Hungarian people too.
Yes.
Like, and maybe one of the most, and one of like the best ways that I've yet seen, right? Because white people love to bring up that various Eastern and not quite waspy enough white people were oppressed too, but like only when it's not appropriate to bring that up, and
right,
and in a way that is not compassionate to those people at all. And I loved like, oh yeah, he could convince the cops to look away just by convincing them that all the children that are disappearing were Hungarian.
Right.
Like that is, added to the brutality of the book, because the book is incredibly brutal and should be assumed by the title. But it was like kind of funny and also just like a good reminder, right? When Russia invaded Ukraine, I said to my wife, like, I wonder how long it's going to be until we have Slavs aren't white people discourse on Twitter. And I don't think we're quite there yet. And I think other things have happened in the world to make that not a thing. But I did see a couple people noting that Russian people were being compared to like Asiatic barbarians in certain articles. So like, maybe my prediction didn't come true, but not for lack of trying on some people's part, which is just like
we're always just it's interesting because those beliefs kind of lingering under the surface, or the old tropes lingering, it seems like they're ancient history, but I think we're always just like close to having things kind of jarred back, that they're there in the consciousness somewhere, even if we think that we're removed from them. The racial stereotypes of the immigrants that came to Chicago in the 1890s and early 1900s. Those were kind of the racial stereotypes of, I remember kids, I grew up in rural Wisconsin, and I remember kids telling Polish jokes, like slurs. And I was like, really, this is, I don't think they necessarily understood that, this is like humor that they heard from like their grandparents or whatever, when it used to really, really mean something. No one really identified as Polish. I think we probably all had some kind of lineage or whatever, or Irish jokes or things like this. But it's close enough that kind of humor is back, just kind of removed from, my grandparents or whatever. So on one hand, it feels like a distant kind of forgotten time. I love looking at the old menus and reading about the markets from that era, and thinking about how kind of how homogenized things have become just in the past couple generations, just in terms of like the foods you might find at a deli or a supermarket, like how a lot of ethnic cuisines have been removed from like cuts of meat and things like that. We would consider, we just wouldn't think of seeing them in a sandwich form or whatever. But 20, 30 years ago, those markers were all around. So I don't know what I'm saying here, but I feel like we're always just very, and we see this now with, I don't want to get too into like stuff I don't know anything about. But I think a lot of tropes that we thought that we were well past in our discourse come flying back pretty quickly. Even just like fascism and things like that 15 years ago, I think people thought we were really well on our way past that. That returns pretty quickly.
Yeah. To the dumb Polak jokes, I'm Polish, and I remember as a kid being horrified to find that my grandparents had a mug that said Polish coffee mug on it, and it was flat all around but had the handle on the inside.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Your grandparents?
My grandparents did. And so, like, I got to see that, like, sliver of reclaiming just turning into something you sell at a garage sale.
Yes.
Which is what happened to it. Somebody bought it, and I hope it was another Polish person. And, like, to that point, I've talked on this very show about how frustrated I feel to not really have any connection with where I come from, right? Like, to the point where, like, learning Polish or learning Hungarian would mean absolutely nothing because there's nobody left alive in my family who I could talk to in those languages, right?
Yeah.
But also Grandpa had a Polish coffee mug with a handle on the inside. So it's like, to your point, I think it's interesting how it doesn't really go away. It just kind of like seeps. And I think especially for, certain things like that tend to be held up as examples. Like, every history book every kid's going to read will have the black and white photo of, like, Irish need not apply. And so for whatever reason, the Irish had a better, like, anti-racism PR team than the Polish and the Hungarians did. And, like, I don't know why that is, right? Like, however many Romani died in the Holocaust, and that's like another one of those things where you only ever hear somebody bring it up at an inappropriate time to make a point against something else. And, like, to that point, I learned recently one of, like, my great aunt was in a concentration camp for the crime of being Hungarian, right? Like, my family's not Jewish, and I had family in the camps. And yeah, we're kind of coming up on time here. I wanted to talk about Clara a little bit because I found it interesting how in the first part she was kind of victim. I guess victim. But by the end of the book had become something else entirely. I'm interested in that idea.
Yeah, I mean, her understanding of herself is slowly evolving. Even in that first, she's surprised by her alignment to things and how her expectations for the kind of person she was and the things that she believed in were not actually what they were. And I think there's that progression by the end of the book where she is somebody who fully embraces what she is, and she considers Robert a hypocrite for kind of vacillating. On one hand, he creates this device that he's very proud of that's able to kill 100,000 people in a blink. And on the other hand, he feels like he should be executed and he's a terrible person. And I think in some ways she's a monster by the end, right? And I think in other ways she's heroic in a sense because she's true to herself. Or at least she's not a hypocrite. She understands what she is. And I think that's something that I was really fascinated with while I was working on the book, is these characters who are coming to understand and embrace how they fall outside of the moral lines, and understanding when their transgressions, or where they act to their heart's deepest impulse and they cross that line, how it fulfills them. I think, and some of them regret it, and others, accept it, embrace it. And I think she's kind of the embodiment of that, from book to book to book, or version of Clara to version of Clara to version of Clara.